It's been said that modern history can be divided into two halves, before 9/11 and after 9/11. Apart from being the deadliest terror attack in American history, the attacks on September the 11th triggered a global domino effect, one that would bring the United States and its allies into innumerable conflicts around the globe, all in the name of counterterrorism. It's now been more than 20 years since the war on terror was declared, but has it actually brought any peace, or is the United States fighting an unwinnable war? Today on Warographics, we're going to provide you with an overview of the global war on terror, its successes, its failures, and its many, many controversies. Just 2 days after the Twin Towers had fallen, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in history, which states that an attack on one member is regarded as an attack on all. Then, on September the 18th, 2001, President George W. Bush signed the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Terrorists. This was intended to punish those responsible for the attacks and prevent something of a similar caliber from ever happening again. The Taliban, who had taken over Afghanistan in recent years, was asked to give up Osama bin Laden and the other members of al-Qaeda, and when they refused, the US and its NATO allies invaded Afghanistan in October 2001 under the codename Operation Enduring Freedom. There had been previous anti-terrorism operations in the country, usually with cruise missiles, but this was a massive escalation of anything that had happened previously. Fighting broke out between coalition forces, the Taliban and al-Qaeda, pretty much across the entire country, and during the chaos, the leaders of al-Qaeda and much of the Taliban managed to escape into Pakistan. There, they regrouped and launched repeated offensives against the coalition forces, leading NATO to counterstrike with Operation Anaconda in 2002, during which the Taliban suffered heavy casualties. In just a few months, the United States has established administrative control over the entire country. But that wasn't the goal of the operation. The alliance wasn't in Afghanistan with the goal of annexing it or setting up a colony. The goal was to eliminate terroristic threats and establish a democratic government. A new Afghan government was set up in 2003, but this was around the same time that the Taliban had regrouped themselves and were now fighting an asymmetrical war, one rife with suicide bombings, urban ambushes, and civilian casualties. And all the while, the hunt for Osama bin Laden continued. 2003 was also when the war on terror began widening its scope, spreading major operations into a second country, Iraq. Ever since its invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the US had officially labeled Iraq as a state sponsor of terrorism, and when the Bush administration accused Saddam Hussein's regime of possessing weapons of mass destruction, Iraq was invaded by NATO allies under the US codename Operation Iraqi Freedom. Airstrikes across the country crippled much of Iraq's fighting power, and the ground invasion began shortly after, consisting of about 250,000 Americans, 45,000 Brits, and a few thousand Australians, as well as a couple of hundred men from the Polish Special Forces unit, GROM. Assisting them were Kurdish rebels in the north of Iraq, a group that had already been fighting with Saddam for years. By April 2003, Baghdad had fallen, and Saddam Hussein was captured shortly after. But much more deadly than the invasion of Iraq was the insurgency that followed it. Guerrilla warfare broke out, led by al-Qaeda-affiliated groups and Islamists fighting a religious war, and the United States launched several large-scale operations to crush their strongholds, much the same as they were doing in Afghanistan. And while Iraq and Afghanistan were embroiled in rebellions and counterinsurgency operations, things started spilling over into Pakistan as well. The Pakistani government was originally hesitant to work with the US, but they ended up taking a very firm stance against extremism and even launched a major offensive of their own into the Waziristan region, sending in more than 80,000 troops with the goal of eliminating al-Qaeda cells that were growing in the area. Pakistan also did its part in hunting down and arresting several high-profile terrorists, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a man who was wanted for his part in the Bajinka plot, a failed attempt in the 1990s to blow up 11 passenger jets and assassinate the Pope. The US also began carrying out drone strikes in various areas of Pakistan, targeting groups that were training and assisting the Taliban. So let's fast forward a few years, and the scene is eerily similar. Extremist combatants holding positions in urban places, rural areas, and in the mountains, with the US and NATO drone striking and raiding their compounds. The United States even passed into a new administration during this, as Barack Obama took office in 2008. But apart from the same old story, some serious victories were scored around the end of the decade, including arguably the biggest success of the entire war on terror: the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011, when US Navy SEALs breached his compound and eliminated him. Interestingly, there was evidence that the raid on bin Laden's compound was the first combat use of helicopters equipped with stealth technology, a fact only discovered later because one of them crashed during the operation. As the years went by, more and more operations were opened as al-Qaeda began spreading into nearby nations. In 2010, Yemen declared war on al-Qaeda, who had been using its vast, largely ungoverned tribal lands as terrorist training camps, and as the war in Yemen progressed into a complete civil war, the United States assisted its governments with drone strikes against insurgents, and Saudi Arabia became further involved in the conventional war on the ground. But almost none of these operations achieved tangible, decisive victories and have often been criticized as merely fighting fire with fire. In response to the international interventions, many newer groups began sprouting up from the ashes, groups such as the Islamic State, whose influence was growing rapidly. And so, just as things were beginning to calm down in Iraq, President Obama announced a new offensive to eliminate the new threat. Quote, "Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy." Following this speech, American forces entered into direct conflict with Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, assisted by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Much of these places have calmed down in the years since, such as Iraq, which has seen the withdrawal of most US troops, and, of course, Afghanistan, which was left in a hasty US withdrawal in 2021, leaving the Taliban to regain control of the country. But as late as 2022, many counterterrorism operations are still ongoing in the region, especially in Syria and Yemen, where Islamic State continues its violent struggle for power. It goes without saying that all this conflict has brought immense suffering to the region, killing hundreds of thousands and displacing millions. But as we're going to cover next, the influence of al-Qaeda and Islamic State isn't restricted to the countries that it was born in. In fact, these groups have seen huge success on a neighboring continent, Africa. The first African operations under the War on Terror began all the way back in 2002 when the Combined Joint Task Force, Horn of Africa, was established in Djibouti. Large-scale counterterrorism campaigns were soon underway in Ethiopia and Kenya. The program then expanded to include the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Initiative, covering most of North Africa. This operation doesn't have a defined enemy like its counterpart in Afghanistan. Instead, much of what the task force does here is train and assist the local governments, especially in places like Niger and Chad. The hope is that one day the government and armed forces will be able to handle the insurgencies on their own, but for most nations, that day has yet to come. Its other main objective is to monitor the region's shipping, which involves intercepting suspected weapons shipments, like a 2002 capture of 30 ballistic missiles when a ship was stopped and searched by a Spanish frigate. The mission in the Horn of Africa also involves hunting down pirates, as Somalia's coast has long been rife with rogue vessels that attack and rob merchant ships. Along with the pirate hunting, Somalia is also home to many of the task force's largest counterterrorism operations, and has been for quite some time now. The US actually intervened in Somalia in the 1990s, but after it withdrew, several new players entered the conflict, hoping to take control of the country, many in response to a call by Osama bin Laden to build an Islamic State in Somalia and resist the influence of the United States. The most powerful of these Islamist groups is al-Shabaab, who have been fighting viciously against the Somali government for more than 15 years now. Since 2007, the United States has provided assistance to Somalia on several occasions in their fight with al-Shabaab, bringing everything from drone strikes to special forces and even large-scale offensives such as the Battle of Ras Kamboni, where the United States bombed an al-Shabaab stronghold town with AC-130 gunships. In late 2020, it seemed like this era was coming to an end when President Trump ordered the withdrawal of all US troops from Somalia, but this decision was reversed in 2022 by President Biden after the Somali government asked the United States for further assistance as terror attacks skyrocketed around the country. But one of the largest conflicts in the African sector of the War on Terror actually doesn't involve the United States. Instead, it was handled mostly by France. In 2012, the West African nation of Mali was thrown into turmoil when its president was ousted in a military coup just before elections. Following the coup, taking advantage of the general chaos in the country, the northern regions of Mali were taken over by an insurgent group known as the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, or MNLA for short. The MNLA was initially backed by an Islamist group called Ansar Dine, but shortly after declaring the independence of their territory, the two groups began fighting amongst themselves, unable to reconcile their differences in how they wanted to govern. The Islamists were joined by several more groups, such as al-Qaeda splinter cells and the Movement for Unity and Jihad in West Africa. After just a few weeks of fighting, the Islamists had taken over the new state of Azawad. And so, with nowhere else to go, the government of Mali asked for foreign intervention to help retake their lands. France answered the call, launching Operation Serval, sending in 3,000 of their men, leading another 3,000 from various African countries. After a year and a half, France and the Mali government had retaken every major city, and the focus shifted into counterinsurgency as the Islamist groups tried to gather their forces. By 2022, though, public sentiment in Mali was staunchly anti-French, especially following 2 military coups the previous year and the new government demanding that France leave. Despite growing numbers of attacks and even the arrival of the Russian mercenary Wagner group into the region, France obliged and left the country in August 2022. Now, if we went through every counter-terrorism operation the task force has engaged in across Africa, we would literally be here all day. But suffice to say that dozens of lethal operations have been carried out in many African nations, including against Boko Haram in Nigeria, Islamic State in Libya, and Al-Qaeda in Cameroon. Afghanistan, Iraq, and the various African deployments generally get the most news coverage when it comes to the operations in the War on Terror. But there's actually a lot more to the mission that doesn't get talked about nearly as much. In the Philippines, for example, the United States deployed 6,000 men to assist the Filipino army in combating groups affiliated with Islamic State. The main goal of the deployment was to train the Filipino forces on effective counterterrorism measures, which included bringing in experienced advisors, providing intelligence, and even having US Special Forces go on patrol in the jungles with their Filipino counterparts. Along with the US, British, and Australian troops have also been deployed to the Philippines. One of the main targets in this deployment is a terrorist organization known as Jemaah Islamiyah, a group dedicated to establishing an Islamic theocracy in Southeast Asia. They're responsible for several devastating terror attacks, such as the 2002 Bali car bombing, which killed more than 200 people in a nightclub and injured 200 more. The US called for an official end to the Philippines sector of the War on Terror in 2014, hailing it as a success. During the operation's time and since, the Philippines and Indonesia have arrested or killed many key members of Jemaah Islamiyah and have thwarted several of their planned attacks. Other miscellaneous operations include overseeing weapon supplies to friendly nations for their own fights, shipment monitoring in the Mediterranean, and sometimes included under the umbrella of the War on Terror are the various Russian operations conducted against Islamic State in the North Caucasus and Syria. More than 20 years of counterterrorism. Hundreds of operations and battles across many countries, and countless successful missions. This is one perspective that you can have when analyzing the global war on terror, and it's largely the perspective that we've taken so far this episode. And truly, there have been some remarkable victories. It's hard to argue with the killing of Osama bin Laden, the toppling of the dictator Saddam Hussein, liberating Mali, and training many governments to properly handle violent insurgency. And everyone applauds the capture of high-profile terrorists and the interception of dangerous weapons. But all of this success has come with quite a high cost. First and foremost is the human cost of war. Estimates vary based on which countries are included and which sources are to be trusted, but rough estimates for the global war on terror usually place the number of killed enemy combatants at around 500,000. This is accompanied by many hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who have been caught in the crossfire. And apart from the deaths, an estimated 35 million people have been displaced from their homes, either because their home was destroyed in combat with terrorist forces, their region was conquered by the Islamic State, or they fled anticipating conflict. More than 20 million have returned home after the situation has been stabilized, but to date, that still leaves more than 10 million people displaced, contributing to significant refugee crises in Africa and Europe. The argument here, of course, is that the loss of life and displaced persons would likely be even higher if the war on terror didn't intervene in many of these conflicts, especially if terror groups like Islamic State were simply allowed to grow into legitimate national powers and cause even bigger problems. But you can't ignore the fact that many civilians have mistakenly been killed by US strikes. After all, collateral damage is hard to predict when dropping a laser-guided bomb from high up in the atmosphere. Obviously, the US does do its best to avoid civilian casualties, but every innocent life lost in the war on terror is a tragedy. But perhaps the biggest criticism of the war on terror resides in its name. You see, terror isn't an identifiable enemy. It isn't a person. It isn't a place that you could just blow up and call it a day. And it is this subjectivity that has given the United States government freedom to do a lot of things, like extend the war whenever necessary, or expand into new territories and carry out airstrikes without difficulty. It also gave them some justification to allow the NSA to begin mass surveillance of American citizens without a warrant. Worse than mass surveillance, though, is the torture. US operatives have been widely known to use torture as a means of interrogation, and since such practices would be highly illegal on US soil, they just do it in another country. So-called black sites are the locations for these advanced interrogation techniques run by the CIA, but whose existence is vehemently denied by the US government. Black sites have been set up in Egypt, Portugal, Scotland, Poland, you name it. The most famous torture site, though, is definitely Guantanamo Bay, known as a legal black hole, because many suspected terrorists are simply kept there indefinitely and never given a trial. And lastly, there's the issue of fighting fire with fire. Many critics around the world argue that terrorism can't be ended through purely violent means, and perhaps there is some truth to that. No matter how many thousands of insurgents are killed, their groups continue to recruit, and somehow they manage to rebuild their numbers. And often when a group's leader is killed or the United States gets involved, all it does is drive the extremists to do something even more drastic, which normally ends up killing even more innocent people. After all, it was really only after the US invaded Afghanistan and Iraq that al-Qaeda's influence began growing in Africa. To many, the war on terror has no end goal. It's a global conflict that the United States will perpetually be a part of with no conclusion in sight. It brings into question the ethics of effectively policing much of the world and the shady practices that have gone along with that, with some going so far as to accuse the US of intentionally constructing a never-ending war to keep the military well-funded. Indeed, as of 2022, it's estimated that more than $8 trillion have been spent across the various missions. So it's very possible that, much like the war on drugs, the war on terror is destined to stay active for decades to come, or at least until terrorism has been completely eliminated. But, well, don't get your hopes up on that one.